kids coming in from other countries, and a number of them have other disabilities, health disabilities and so forth. So I guess looking forward, I'm thinking, are there ways that we can either refine the data, although I think this is so complicated, I'm not sure we can ever do that, but more in terms of operationally, how can we ensure that we're fair to the schools and we're providing, and that through the whole intervention process, it's positive and recognizes the differences.
If I can just chime in for a moment to address one part of Peter's question. Part of the file I just got from OSPI on Thursday did have school level, disability type, school level information about number of students and percentage of students with each disability. So we can start to look at a school by school difference between high performing groups and low performing groups, and at least look at it in the context of disability type. And then we can start factoring in other things such as poverty and mobility and English language learners, for example.
So I have Dan, Holly, Deborah, and then Connie, and then I think we'll go on to the next part of the presentation.
Thank you. As a father of a student now through school, but who had both a learning and a physical disability, there's a component of when I read your report that struck me as really troubling. And it wasn't so much in what you presented, and I don't know what to do with this, but you had the statement at the table that showed that 90% of these students were getting C's or better in grades, and yet a good percentage of them, when tested, were anywhere from 3 to 5 years behind. And it's really troubling, having fought all the way through my son's education to make sure that he wasn't just being passed along, but getting an education, that I don't know what to do with that comment, but it was the most troubling thing. I think the disaggregation of the information is critical to getting a better handle, but I think there's a real issue when the grades are so disparate from the performance. And to me, I don't know if that's a question of, pushing people through the system, the inaccuracies of, how we're tallying grades. I don't know what that is, but I would hate for that to get lost in this discussion, because it was my child, and I just got this test score, and he was coming out of high school, and you told me he was 5 years behind in his education based on the assessment, I would throw a royal fit. And I think we need to look at that component very carefully if we're talking about giving people with disabilities true educational opportunity. We have to make sure that we don't lose that component.
So I've just spent the last 6 weeks really digging into this, and I'm trying to shuffle through. I don't want to take more of my airtime, so I'm trying to shuffle through what's important, but I want to start out by speaking to Dan's point. So one of the things that you showed in your presentation, Andrew, is that, Washington State roughly matches the national average for special education qualification rates at around 13%. And I wanted to know what that number represented, and what the implications were to how districts qualify students for special ed. And so, because when I started looking at the specific learning disability category specifically, it seemed to me that if you look at sources outside of the education system, national organizations for a specific learning disability, like dyslexia, for example, research from credible institutions, Yale, Harvard, places like that, that the outside of the education system, the predicted percentage of the population that has, varying learning disabilities is significantly higher than 13%. For example, if you look at dyslexia, it's upwards of 20% of the population has some form of dyslexia. So I was curious, where does that 13% come from? And maybe you could look at this, but I found one reference to it from a paper in the early 80s that 13%. And so when IDEA was first written, it was written with that funding cap in place. And it's very curious to me what kind of pressure that puts on the system, because if you look at it across the country since 1978, before many of these categories even existed as a disability category, the qualification rate has stayed relatively stable, 12 to 13.5%, depending on what the funding cap is. It goes right up to that funding cap. And if you look at districts that, and the federal and state law allows districts to determine their own qualification procedure. What the law requires is that a district have a procedure and a policy on file, and there's two legal methodologies you can use. You can use what's called a discrepancy model, where you look at a student's IQ and what you would expect their performance, their academic performance to be relative to that IQ. And if their academic performance is what you would expect for that particular IQ, they don't qualify under the specific learning disability category. They're just sort of out of luck. Or you can use a response to intervention model, which is very narrowly defined. I think, this might not be accurate information because it's changing, but the last time I looked, there was 9 districts in the state that were using the RTI model because it's extremely resource intensive and expensive to run. And so you end up with this neuropsychology model where you're identifying students based on typically discrepancy, and it's not related to, so then on top of that, since then, right, so then you have NCLB and you have standards-based education, and instead of looking at a student's IQ, we're saying, oh, there's no bell curve here, right? You're not looking at the bottom 8% or 2% or whatever. We're saying all kids have to achieve. All kids have to meet academic standards, and yet we have this 13% funding cap in place. What do districts do with that, right? So if you have, my district has a 19 point, I want to say 4% of our population is qualified for special education. What do you do to support those students in an RTI very resource-intensive model when the funding cap is at 13%? What do you do with that, right? So again, it's that expectation vice what are we front-loading in the system to come underneath and, float all boats. So that's one thing. The other, so that's in response to your question. I think in some ways, Dan, it's a dilemma, and it's a really important dilemma, and I don't think people are asking that question. I think it's the important question to ask, right? And then the other question that I have, or just thing that I think isn't necessarily represented in here, and I want to say, Connie, this was to you. I think you were the person that asked the question about, no, Cindy. Are we looking at the growth students are making relative to their IEP or relative to a level 3 on a test? And students on IEPs, if they are taking a test that relates to their IEP goal area or their qualifying condition, can meet standard for the purpose of graduation at a level 2. And I tried to disaggregate that data from OSPI data from CEDARS and from the Washington State Report Card a year ago, and it's very, very difficult to tell what numbers of our students with disabilities are graduating, having met one or more of the graduation requirements at L2 vice L3. I believe the achievement index shows those students as not meeting standard because for federal accountability purposes, an L2 does not meet standard. So I believe on the index, students could be having met standard and be graduating at L2, but we would show them as not meeting standard on the index.
Deborah and then Kevin.
So there are definitely multiple issues at play, and the questions that you raised for us, Andrew, one having to do with the index and being able to better disaggregate populations of special ed students to get a better handle on should that school receive additional support. That's one set of questions. And then the other set of questions have to do with what Holly and Dan are saying, around the kinds of supports that students need based on the disability that they have. So as we move forward to think about this at our retreat, I hope we can have both conversations because they're related, but they're, both need attention. And that, to a large extent, did not come through. It was a focus on the data and what we should be looking at and trying to understand what the population is. But on top of that, we need to say, how do we best support these students? And are there policy recommendations that we need to be making that can really better that? And what conversations do we need to be having with whom, begin to get at that? And we haven't even, you raised the issue of the additional overlays, kids who are homeless, kids who are in foster care, ELL, race, all of that comes into play. And how do we, so we need to have like a broader conversation as we think about this for our retreat.
Kevin, and then we're gonna move on to Parker's.
Mine is a little bit more anecdotal, but I think there's some information I heard Andrew say earlier. You are getting that data by the school. A couple of years ago, when I was sort of at the end of my productive work life, I was interviewing for a position. One of those positions, or a number of positions, but one of those positions was at a small, what do I want to call it, private support school that handles autistic kids on Mercer Island. And the person there who had the job and was looking to replace herself had been a mother, who'd been an activist, and who worked in the tech industry. And she said this explicitly to me, there are high-functioning autistic people working in the tech industry, and they are having children that are highly functioning and autistic. So one would anticipate that as the autism rate grows, that you would see some clusters, and of course you would see them on the east side, and I know others are familiar with that. I'm curious if that will be borne out, and if it's more just a broader, autism is identified more clearly now, and it's across all places, or if we would see those concentrations in places like the east side and with tech, and then kind of it sit